recording started. All right, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us at our NACBS book event on Hear Our Voices, a powerful retelling of the British Empire through 20 true stories by Radhika Natarajan and co-author Chow Tayana with illustrations by Alexander Mostov. So today Radhika will be joined by Christina Fryer to discuss the work, as well as the process of adapting her scholarship on modern imperial Britain for a young audience. So I will begin by briefly introducing our speakers, and then I will turn it over to Christina and Radhika to get started. So Radhika Natarajan is a historian of modern imperial Britain. Her scholarly research focuses on migration, citizenship, and welfare in post-war Britain. She received her PhD from the University of California, Berkeley, and she teaches at Reed College in Portland, Oregon. Hear Our Voices, that we're going to be talking about today, is her first book for children. And so she'll be joined in conversation with Christina Fryer, who is writer and independent historian of Britain and the Caribbean. She is currently writing her first book, Entangled Lands, A Caribbean History of Britain, which will be published by Penguin Allen Lane. So I hope you guys will all join me in welcoming Christina and Radhika.
Thank you all for having us. Thank you all for being here on a Thursday. For those of you in the UK, we are technically on our spring break, Easter break. But thank you all for being here, and thank you, Radhika, for both for the book and for joining me in this conversation. I'll repeat a little bit of what Amanda has just said in terms of setting up the conversation. The book that we are talking about, which I have a copy of here, really wonderful book, is called Hear Our Voices, a powerful retelling of the British Empire through 20 true stories. It's written by Radhika Natarajan and Chow Tayana and illustrated by Alexander Mostov. In my opinion, this is an extraordinary children's, or actually the technical term I think is middle grade, book for children who are 8 to 12. It offers a complex and nuanced account of the British Empire, as sophisticated as any historical monograph. I'm sure Radhika will challenge that, but I'm sticking to it. But it is also suitable for children. The focus is on the lives of 20 people who experienced or challenged British colonialism rather than on those who conducted it. And through their stories, Radhika and Chow present an overview of the British Empire from the late 1500s to essentially the present, walking the young reader through the different forms the British imperialism took across time and place. At the center are Indigenous stories of First Nations people, Maroons, Black activists, Irish nationalists, Kenyan resistance fighters, and so many more. It's an important work and one that I hope gets more attention in the coming months. So Radhika, if I could start with the question I'm sure many of us are asking or thinking about, what led you to write a children's book?
Yes, and thank you so much, Christina, for joining me in this conversation. I'm really looking forward to it and to hearing all your questions and comments when we have more of a Q&A later on. I never set out to write a children's book. Instead, I was contacted by Wide-Eyed Editions of Quarto Press in the summer of 2021. They already had the vision for the book. It really was a post-Black Lives Matter project for them in the wake of the protests that erupted worldwide after the murder of George Floyd. They saw an absence in the children's book market in the UK that accounted for the history of the British Empire and explained its relationship to the present. And so they actually first reached out to Chow Tayana, my co-author, and she is a digital archive specialist based on Kenya. One of her most prominent projects is the Archive of British Colonialism, or the Museum of British Colonialism, which is a digital archive project. And they approached her first. They already had Alexander Mostov, the illustrator, in place. They approached Chow and asked her if she would be interested in writing this children's history of the British Empire. They already had the format that it would be told through 25 biographies. And she said no. She said she felt comfortable writing the African diaspora stories, or the African stories, but that she did not feel capable or interested in taking on the larger project. And at that point, they approached me. And And when they contacted me, I was still pre-tenure. I'm now an associate professor, but at the time, thank you. But at the time I was not, and that was on my mind as I thought about whether or not to take on this project. I knew it would be a huge commitment of time. I knew it would take me away from my more academically oriented projects. And I was unsure how my colleagues at Reed or my colleagues in the field would receive it. And so I ultimately decided to take on the project because it's going to get more readers than anything I write academically. And that felt like, important to take on. And I felt like the kinds of teaching that I do here at Reed, in kind of thinking in broad ways about empire in order to explain it to my students, to teach my students, it made me feel like it was something I could take on. And ultimately I decided it would be worthwhile to do so.
I think I certainly want to come back to that question maybe towards the end of the kind of traditional path, or the way we think of the traditional academic path, and the way that you've just articulated that as almost being worried that there's a clash. So I think I imagine we'll come back to that question. So you said that that when they came to you, that they already had this biographical approach in mind. How did they present that to you, and did you kind of feed into or shape what that has actually come to look like in the final product?
Yeah, and I have a little presentation because it's a beautifully illustrated book, and the illustrations are the best part. So I'm going to share my screen with you so I can provide some visuals to accompany our discussion. Um, can everyone see my screen okay? Um, so they had already had the format, and Alexander had actually already started kind of mocking up what the cover might look like, or what the conception of the project might be. And they had the idea that the book would be geographically organized. There would be a section on North America, a section on Africa, a section on South Asia, a section on, Oceania, and that each of the stories, the figures would be sort of contained within that section and kind of tell the story of British imperialism within that kind of geographical area. And they also had ideas of who would be included. And I'd love to talk about this further. It included both who we might call imperialists as well as colonial subjects. And they wanted to present both of these kind of sets of figures because they were really interested in engaging children, young audiences, through presenting first-person narratives. So the book is written in the first person, or at least the biographies are. There's explanatory material written in the third person. I call them biographies. I don't call them autobiographies because that doesn't feel appropriate. But the biographies are written in the first person. And they felt like this would be a way to engage young readers. And they were really interested in showing motivations and the perspectives of individuals as they kind of navigated the empire. And so one of the first things that I said is that I was not supportive of this approach that really broke down geographies, because so much of the way I thought about empire was as a set of connected histories. And I was also really interested in movement, and to show the ways that colonial subjects themselves moved through empire, and in doing so, kind of showed a larger range of experiences, perspectives on empire, relationships to empire, than just those who kind of went out into the world and did the empire, and those who were kind of on the receiving end of it. So that was a very early reconceptualization of their project. But I did write the first draft of the book with 25 figures that included both imperialists and who we might generalize as colonial subjects.
So the book has you sort of are alluding to this. The book has a specific structure, and it's more than simply the biographies. You have the biographies. You also have the explanatory material, which I think is also really important to kind of how you set up. There's explanatory material at the beginning that kind of sets the stage of what the empire is and what it is that the reader is about to read. And then there's material at the end as well that I think is really important. And then there's also the structure in terms of on the specific page itself and how these biographies are told. How did that structure come about? And in particular, I imagine that there was quite an important relationship with the illustrator so that the story is happening through both illustration and the text. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so many of you who are familiar with middle grade literature might be familiar with biography anthologies. I'd say in the last 10 to 15 years or so, these have become incredibly popular as a way of, sharing history with young readers, with middle grade readers especially. And these anthologies are identity based. And Wide Eyed Editions has published several of them. And I knew that this book was not a project that brought together individual stories through identity. Instead, it was about shared experience. And I was really thinking also about how the figures in the story, we weren't selecting them because they were heroes. We were selecting them, or I was selecting them, because their personal stories, their individual stories, helped us understand something bigger about the British Empire. And so I resequenced the book vaguely chronologically, so that the biographies are ordered based on a loose chronology. And then, and again, kind of moving away from um, um, a sense, I don't want to say that identity isn't at all a part of it, but that it was really what connected these stories is the experience of empire and how their stories helped us understand larger dynamics of empire. And again, because there were, ultimately 20 figures in the book, there started off as 25, we could tell different slices of that imperial story and not worry about each story being sort of complete in and of itself. And so that's like how the structure of the book kind of came into being kind of in a big way. But then thinking about the individual pages, each page is focused on an event. And so when we were putting together and I say we because I had two student research assistants who really helped me pull together all the scholarship and help me write summaries for individual. And what we wanted, and again, Cordo is the one who came up with the format for the spreads. All of them are focused on an event. And so that event kind of guided the chronology of the book, and it organized each individual story. And so this is the figure of Sadat Hassan Munto, a Muslim, Indian, and eventually Pakistani writer who wrote so beautifully about partition and the heartache of partition and leaving Bombay for Pakistan because it was no longer possible for him to live and work as a Muslim in post-independence India. And so when we decided that that would be the scene for the book, for that spread, then the text was organized as kind of leading up to that event and then kind of explaining what the significance was. And so it includes a wider biography of Munto, but we're really, instead of trying to tell the whole story of his life in 500 words, it's really about kind of leading up to this event on each person's page and kind of explaining its significance.
And I think one of the other things, in keeping with what you were saying earlier about kind of moving away from a geographical, this geography, then this place, then this place, the loosely chronological approach means that we're kind of moving back and forth across all of the areas that are covered in the book in a way that I think is really captivating if you sort of read it if you read it through. Um, I think his story in particular leads us to this next question, which is about the challenges of writing a history of the British Empire for children, and in particular the fact that this is in many places a very violent history, with incredibly fraught historical events. We're looking at this spread here about partition. There are others in the book. These are really fraught historical events to share with young readers. How did you go about navigating those challenges?
Yeah, was, first of all, the fact that this was 8 to 12-year-olds was always central in my mind. And the second is that the emphasis was on like individual experience, motivations, and perspectives. And so from a storytelling aspect, like really kind of bringing a personal experience to the page as a way of kind of setting up the history was also, again, the writing challenge for me in my mind. And then the third kind of thing to think about is each of these spreads is 500 to 600 words. And so how can you convey complex, full kind of history, even if it's not complete, in 500 to 600 words, and that's appropriate for children? And I was really guided by my reading of scholars of children's literature, especially those who focus on the US and the way that histories of slavery, of colonialism in North America, and the experiences of Native Americans have talked about how to write histories that both affirm, children's identity, and also are what they call healing histories, so that that doesn't mean that you shy away from violence, but rather you help explain it to children so that they can understand these contexts of the present, of really understanding the present. And so there have been several articles that I read, and one of them particularly was focused on studying the history of the civil rights movement. And they noticed that in depictions of the civil rights movement in the US, there was a very individualist approach that many children's book authors took, and many of them were about victories. And the scholars who were studying the histories of the civil rights movement for children said what that does, it erases the kind of collective action and mobilization that was necessary in the civil rights movement. And it also makes it seem as if racism is over, as if somehow the victories in the book make it seem as if the story has ended, it's finished, that's in the past. And so thinking about how the violence of the present creates the need for a complex but honest account of the past was just that nonetheless sort of affirms kind of children's identities and communities, and also is accessible. That was really, I think, the hardest challenge of writing the book.
And so do I take it from what you've just said, in particular about having to turn to literature about um, a scholarship about children's literature based in the US context, do I take it that there is either less scholarship or less work of this kind happening in Britain, whether that is less scholarship on the topic or less or fewer children's books being written about these kinds of more challenging topics?
I mean, I have not found any children's literature scholarship about writing history in Britain. This is, I wouldn't say I've exhaustively searched, but I certainly did search, and I could not find it. So I don't think either that the study of children's literature is as developed in the UK, or the history that is presented to children in the UK has not really been kind of thought through in the way that it has by US. And we can't get into this now, but the civil rights movement in the US made children, their education central to their goals. Like this, from the time of Du Bois, if not earlier, and the crisis, and thinking about the experiences of Black children in the US, there is a long tradition in the US of thinking about how Black children particularly experience education, the kind of reading material that they read. This is a developed conversation. I don't think the equivalent exists in the UK. And I mean, you can tell us better than I can since you live in the UK. They're very interested in the Tudors and World War II. In a lot of ways, if you go to a British bookstore and look at the history section, that's what you'll find. So there are now histories of the British Empire for children. Satnam Sangera wrote one for older children that I think came out last summer, I think, and there was one others, and I can't remember the name of that author. But really, this is not a history that is made accessible to children, at least not in commercial children's publishing.
Yeah, and I think David Olusoga there's a children's version of David Olusoga's Black and
That's
British
right. Yeah.
as well. Again, I think it is similarly as with Sathnam Sangera. I think it's similarly an older age group as opposed to the age group that you are writing to here. And I think to that question of kind of what's going on in Britain, I think a lot of it actually does have to do with what UK publishing has been interested in and has been willing to publish. Um, and I think that the kind of connection between activist movements in the UK and their interest in education, then the connection to like people who are publishing and um, the levers of power in the publishing world, like those connections are really, really, really detached.
And if I could say one more
Yeah,
thing,
please do.
like going back to my slide, these are all books that are published by Wide-Eyed Editions, which my publisher, who's based in the UK, they're very much also thinking about how their books are going to be received in the US market. So there's a way that even in British publishing, they're thinking about the US market and not necessarily writing for the British market. So
Mhm.
that's another small thing to think about.
So connected to this question of how do you write a history of what could be considered quite fraught material, the other thing that I noticed when reading the book is that language seems to be incredibly important. Both, and I think it is generally when we're writing history, but it's especially so I think when you're writing a history for younger readers. And you have a really careful approach to language throughout the book. How did you navigate that challenge?
So, a couple of things to say about the writing. This has certainly been the hardest writing project in my career. Writing an academic monograph or articles has nothing on trying to write a history of the British Empire for children, like, strictly in terms of the writing. So one thing I mentioned before is how short each of the spreads are, 500 to 600 words. So there was the question of how do you really simplify language? How do you not rely on our specialist vocabulary that we can take for granted that our academic reader will understand when writing for children? So that one was a really important one. And I was really lucky because in Portland, there's actually so many children's book authors who live here. And I was part of a writing group with children's book authors, and they were all writing fiction. And, some younger picture books, some older like YA fiction. And they really pushed me to think about the language, what would be accessible for this audience, and also the storytelling. Like, how was I making it compelling for an 8 to 12-year-old? And I think that the two are really related. And the other thing is that they kept asking me is, I think they found my first drafts a little dry. They kept asking me, can't you just kind of make something up here? And I was like, no. This is obviously an imaginative writing project. I'm writing in the first person, but I have to draw the line at, creating events or so that again was a challenge. And my editor was also giving me a lot of feedback on the language and the vocabulary and thinking about what would be accessible to children, what needed further explanation, what was too much detail. So that was definitely part of the process. And we also had 3 sensitivity readers. 2 of whom were based in the UK, and one of whom, well, actually, sorry, 1 was based in the UK and 2 were based in the US. And so the sensitivity readers were, again, thinking about the language, and particularly like sensitivity readers, you get information about their identity groups that they kind of claim belonging in. And so really thinking about how children with disabilities might read the book, Native American children, Black children, British Asian children, how might they experience the book, and where were some of the questions around language that both like what language wouldn't be accessible, but also what language might be harmful. And the sensitivity readers are really thinking in relationship to harm. And it was incredibly helpful to get their feedback. And some of their feedback is really at odds with the kind of ways that historians use language and the things that we take for granted about the violence of the language that we use. And one of the things that I learned about myself is how inured to the violence of empire I have become as a scholar, and how much I take for granted about it. And the sensitivity readers kind of really helped me, I don't know, kind of experience the shock and horror of some of these events in a new way.
That sounds like incredible. I mean, certainly in terms of my own writing for a trade press, this is something I've been thinking about quite a lot with in relation to slavery, that question of what is it appropriate to write, and like what have I become very accustomed to? What is appropriate to write? What about sort of people's um oftentimes last moments are the ones that show up in the record. Are we,
Yeah,
how much of those details are we including? But then also on the flip side, the question is if you are not putting any of that information in, you are also making it seem as though these are all kind of mild
that's right.
or inconvenient moments, as opposed to incredibly terrible, scarring and searing moments. And that challenge, I think, is one that I think actually as historians in whatever we're publishing, we need to be thinking about a little bit more. And but it's coming up in writing for these varied audiences.
Yeah.
Um, Related to this, I'd actually love to hear how you approach the names and naming in this book. There's a very careful. It seems like there's a very careful approach.
Yeah, and I wasn't sure if you had a specific example that you're thinking of, but one that comes to mind is Tejoni Hokurawa's spread, which is the first spread in the book. And I knew from the beginning he was the first person I wanted to include. I was very inspired by scholars, and in the case of Tejoni Hokurawa, called Thrush's Indigenous London, which just reminds us that Indigenous peoples are not tied to one location, but we're actively moving around empire, pursuing their own interests, engaging in diplomacy. And so Tejoni Hokurawa traveled to London in 1710 with 3 others to appeal to Queen Anne to help them against the French. And so we might call him Mohawk, but also now we're rethinking language, and we might also call him Kanian Kaha. And that is not familiar language. And, we're also much more used to hearing the Iroquois Confederacy than the Haudenosaunee. And so it was really important to me that Kanian Kahaka was in the book, even if we were also saying Mohawk in parentheses. So thinking about not just how Tejoni Hokurawa might have identified himself, but what are the names that are important to these communities today? And
Mhm.
so, the Mohawk use Mohawk, but they also, talk about themselves in relationship to Kani and Kaha. So to kind of use those multiple naming conventions in the interest of both legibility and also like respect and acknowledgement of how people are naming themselves was kind of how I was thinking about the language, that part, the naming part of language in the book. Is there another example that you were thinking of?
I mean, that was the main example, in part because it is, it is the first one, and it really stands out. But also, I mean, the interesting thing here, though, is that you are writing for a British audience for whom, let's say, Iroquois is not actually standard language or a common term. And so, in fact, there is a power in actually for some of the readers' first um, uh, for their first encounter to be Haudenosaunee as opposed to Iroquois, that is also really important given that this is, a text that is published in the UK. This too has been something that I've been thinking about in my own work in terms of growing up in southeastern Virginia. And then becoming a historian of Britain, you suddenly realize where all of the names of all the
Yes,
place names came from.
yes.
But they are deeply familiar to me and deeply familiar to nobody else. And so there is that sense of well, just because it's familiar to me doesn't actually mean it's familiar to my readers. And so how am I thinking about what I'm introducing and the language I'm using when it's only familiar to me? I think is a really powerful reframing. You mentioned that there were originally 25 people and now there are 20. So what happened to the other 5?
So I wrote the book when Wide-Eyed Editions approached me. They had the idea that the figures that would be included in the book would be both imperialist as well as colonial subjects. And again, using colonial subjects in a very kind of broad way. So the book included Robert Clive, James Cook, Edward Colston, and David Livingston. And these are 4 spreads that Alexander did full illustrations for. And the idea was that they really wanted, again, thinking about motivations and thinking about, who were these people who were pro-British Empire, who, actively contributed to its expansion, who actively participated in the transatlantic slave trade, who were they and why did they participate in empire? Why did they contribute to its expansion? And that was important to them. That was their vision. And when they presented that to me, I did have concerns. And as I was writing the first draft of the manuscript, those were the hardest to write. And it's interesting because on the one hand, we had the most source material for these individuals. Cook, kept diaries. We have his own accounts. Same with like Livingston, Clive was, biography. Macaulay wrote, a biography of Clive. We have a lot on these individuals, and yet trying to write their perspectives, their point of view, was actually incredibly troubling and hard for me. And yet though, I came to feel it was important to include their voices because empire was not an abstract phenomenon. It was not a faceless phenomenon. It was people. And it felt like including their stories in this project was a way of acknowledging the people who made the British Empire, who expanded and sustained it. But then after the first draft of the manuscript was submitted, the team at Quarto, they kind of circulated it among the internally as well as with some external folks like consultants, and they felt like they needed to cut these figures. And the reason that they gave for cutting the figures was one, that they didn't think the book would be as marketable, that the book was already kind of hard to understand. Again, thinking about what other biography anthologies look like and how they're organized. Having the British Empire as the frame makes it a strange book in the children's book market. But then also including imperialists alongside those who kind of experienced and contested empire also felt troubling to them in terms of how they would explain it to the public. And so we cut the 5 imperialists who were in the store in the book, and instead we moved them to a single spread. And instead of their stories being in the first person, now they were in the third person. So again, in kind of my historian's voice, I rewrote their stories and collapsed them into a paragraph each. So we still talk about, like, you know, these individuals who shaped the empire, but we do so in the third person and kind of reduce them. And I think that, you know, a marketing demand, again, is like to have histories that focus around heroes. And it made it incredibly problematic to have these individuals included in the book, I think, from their perspective.
It's like, that's so fascinating. I'm sure we'll get into that a little bit more in the Q&A. So one final question that I have before opening up to Q&A, and I hope that love to hear what people think about this conversation and about this kind of work. If people are interested in writing history for children, what should they know, and how should they be going about it?
Yeah, and I'll stop the share now. I think the first thing that you need to know, that in children's book publishing, the editorial team has a lot of power. And so we actually take for granted how much autonomy we have as authors, even though we, you know, submit our work through to editorial processes and peer review. Ultimately, as an author, we have so much control over our work. That's not the case in publishing, in commercial publishing, especially children's book publishing. The editorial team had a lot of authority over the work, and there was only so much I could say in response. So, you know, I had to make my case sometimes when we had conflicts, but ultimately they were the ones who got to decide. The second thing I would say is that this project really encouraged me to think about audience in a way that felt very new. Than what I was used to in relationship to scholarship, writing scholarly works. Really thinking about what I was communicating and how, and especially because the audience is children, how it would be received, how it would impact them. I think that that was incredibly new. And then the other thing is, my publishing experience is incredibly unusual. You know, children's book authors work for years to find an agent, to get their work before editors, and to have this experience where they reached out to me to write this book. I'm understanding just how unusual that is, and how lucky I was really to come into this project.
Well, thank you so much, Radhika. Amanda, I don't know how you want to proceed, but I think we are happy to throw open to questions.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Radhika. This is so interesting. And I know I also have a bunch of questions, but I will give everyone a chance in the audience first. If anyone has a question, just raise your little Zoom hand. Yeah. And we'll go ahead and get started with Jeffrey. Go ahead.
Hi, Radhika. First of all, I just like that was fantastic. And I think first and foremost, I just want to commend you for letting yourself pursue this kind of a project. You know, we've got our whole academic careers to write the kinds of academic works that we were trained to do. And I just think it speaks so highly of you that that you pursued this. So I just wanted to share that. First of all, I do have two questions to start with. I probably have a dozen more, but I'll start with two. So the first is, I'm curious who you're sorry you were not able to include among the 20. And then my second question, and then I'll put myself back on mute, is I'm curious whether you kind of workshopped this book or drafted it at all with your Reed College students, right, who are, let's say, just kind of maybe 8 to 10 years at most older than your target audience. And if you did, sort of what sort of feedback and responses you got from them?
Thank you. I would say I have these spreadsheets of potential figures for the book, and there are probably like 3 or 4 people who, for every one person who was not in the book. The book came out the week after the Israeli invasion of Gaza, and I wish that I had included a Palestinian figure. There were a couple from the 1935 uprisings in Palestine that I was thinking about including, but when we think about the legacy of the British Empire and the ways that this history matters in the present, that was definitely on my mind after, publication, like after it had been put to rest and there was really nothing I could do. There were like when we were thinking about the list, it got incredibly transactional, like how many figures from the Caribbean are there? How many figures from South Asia? How many women? How many men? And so in that, I think we did, in the interest of balance, in the interest, which I do think is important and I'm completely on board with, but there were figures that were lost and I think figures that would have really offered like a different point of view than the ones that we were able to present. So for instance, I would have loved to, for the South Asian stories, to have included Ambedkar or someone from the self-respect movement in Tamil Nadu in India to really show the caste politics of the independence movement. Or in thinking again about the ways that, the struggles and we weren't choosing heroes and we were trying not to think about victories, but to think about how, imperial politics shaped post-colonial realities and to think more about, the different contexts in which we can see that playing out to this day. But there were too many 20th century voices. So I would say that there were a lot of 20th century voices that were kind of cut so that we could tell stories from the 18th century. So I only named a couple of people, but there were just too many to include. And then I have hired 4 Reed students to work with me on this project. 2 were part of the research side of it. So they helped me, like I said, read the scholarship. This book is very informed by scholarship, and they helped me put together kind of, I don't know what to call them, like summaries of biographies. They helped me pull like what would the key moment be. They helped me kind of like crystallize like point of view, interest, perspective, like those kinds of narratively compelling aspects of these individual stories. And I didn't workshop the drafts with Reed students, but those researchers that I worked with were really shaping like what I included and how, not just the research they did, but the conversations we had about what interested them in these stories, like how were they thinking about it. And I was very lucky that both of those 2 students, Betsy White and Zoe Lee DeVito, they had taken history classes with me. So they had a little bit of background with some of these histories, and they were just amazing to work with and were a really important part of this project.
Excellent. And then Danny, you want to go ahead?
Sure thing. Radhika, I'm so excited about this book and on so many different levels. I didn't realize it was actually out yet, so I've been waiting for this to like go order it, but now I can finally go order it right now.
Yes.
I have a almost 7-year-old and an almost 10-year-old at home, and they are obsessed with atlases and books. So like they will be very, very happy to get this. I have one sort of observation and then a question, although I have a long list of questions. As you were talking about the sort of removal of the imperialists from the book after you had done the work of writing that. What came to mind was this amazing documentary about the West Indian cricket team in the 70s and 80s, Fire in Babylon, where they similarly did all of this work, where they interviewed people, they interviewed English people, Australian cricketers, South Asian cricketers, and then they decided, actually, no, this is a West Indian story in the movie itself, we're only going to have West Indian voices, and I think it is much stronger as a result. So I can certainly see that sort of anxiety of both the difficulty and the anxiety associated with that, but I suspect that is a good choice. And then the question is really just about like collaboration as a process. What did that look like with your co-author, with your illustrator? I mean, the act of writing for academic historians is so solitary so often that I imagine that was also a new experience.
Yeah, thank you. I'll have to look for this film. I haven't seen it before. It sounds good. Yeah, I mean, this was a very collaborative project, but there actually wasn't a lot of collaboration between us, at least not explicitly. So we had one meeting at the very beginning of the process, and Chow wasn't able to actually attend a Zoom meeting, but it was me, Alexander, and the editorial team. And that was the only time that Alexander and I talked in person before I reached out to him after the book was published. And so Chow wrote 6 of the spreads. 4 of them are ultimately in the book. And she was able to choose those authors, although I had the right to approve. And then I also like lightly edited some of the work, and I especially edited the context boxes that were in each of the on each of the pages for her spread. But other than that, you know, she did those parts and I did kind of all the other parts. And we have since spoken, and we got to talk about our experiences with the editors and with working on this project. So it was really nice to connect to her, but that didn't happen until the book was already in press. The relationship with Alexander, and I'd love to share my screen again because I think his work on this book is so amazing. Was so interesting because all of our conversation went through the editorial team. And so I would get sketches like this one for the Captain Cook spread. And the editor would give me some questions that they had. And I just remember when I got this spread, because the questions they asked were, would this be the appropriate flag that Cook and his men would have flown? And I started to do research on that, and I was like, I don't ultimately care. I know that there are military historians who probably care very much about this, but ultimately, I don't think it's a detail that matters. The bigger issue here is that they're presenting Botany Bay as empty. And we can't include that in the book, 1, because it was not historically accurate, and 2, because it produces the idea of terra nullius that made, you know, it possible for Cook and others to claim lands they said were empty. And so, you know, my feedback was thinking about, well, what's historically significant? You know, this is the key image that is framing the story. What does it need to convey? But all of that conversation went through the editors. And if I can share one more, William Cuffey is in the book. He was a leader of the Chartist movement. His father was an enslaved man, and he was born free in London. And he was shipped to Australia. What's that called? Transported. He was transported to Australia for you know, a crime against the Queen. And again, another one of these lives that shows these relationships across space in the British Empire. And this is an image of Kennington Common, the Chartist rally in 1848 that was ultimately called off. And I got this image, and to me, Cuffey looks confused. And I was like, he cannot look confused. He was so angry that the march was called off. And again, like thinking about what are the details that matter and how are they conveying the history and its significance. And I don't know that if you had told me what the picture should look like, I would have thought about this. But because there was this process, this back and forth, I was able to kind of reflect on it and think about, is this, you know, another thing I noticed was that if you look at the image of Kennington Common, there are photographs of that day. The speakers are on a wagon. I was like, oh, should there be wheels and a horse? And ultimately I was like, no, that doesn't matter. But he can't look confused because he was so invested in this event and he was so angry when it was called off. So ultimately what we settled on, or what they settled on, I didn't get to choose, was that he was supportive of the speakers. And I don't know exactly the decision that went into that, but that I thought was an interesting way that they took my feedback. If you're interested, I can talk about a couple more spreads. Alexander put so much work. My students and I, we sent him some visual research to use as sources for the images, but he put so much effort into finding like historical visual documentation and helping that kind of craft his scene. So this is the Claudia Jones spread, which depicts the first carnival in London from 1959. And so you can see the ways that some of the photographs of that event are translated to the illustration. This is some of his image research that he did for the Rani of Jhansi spread. And you can just see how much he went into finding out, like, you know, what the fort looked like, what the weapons looked like, what the uniforms might have looked like. And again, I just think that he did such an amazing job. And if you will allow me, I can play you a animation he made of how he developed the spread. So you can see how many layers went into the making of this one spread. And while we watch it, it's not that long. I'm happy to take further questions if people have them about the illustrations particularly.
I'm curious, just to follow up. Oh, well, I love this sort of back and forth about the illustration, because I think in so many ways I was thinking about even the pushback of how the editors conceptualize things. But yeah, the illustration's so much in the same way about like trying to, you know, incorporate what's important to incorporate and, you know, making those decisions. But Hillary, would you like to go ahead?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, hey, right. You already answered my question which was about kind of periodization, distribution, and the illustrate. I mean, I'm so struck by the Botany Bay looks just like the image. I mean, I show in my lecture because it's the image. And looking at the Claudia Jones and the Jhansi one is so much more interesting with the Cuffy, right? Like, how did he generate images of that which we don't have?
Yeah.
Like a typical image for.
Yeah.
But I actually wanted to ask about, considering your own academic scholarship, how you negotiate, or whether it was completely up to you, kind of gender inclusion within the book.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was really important for all of us to have women included in the book and included in different ways. So you know, there's the Rani of Jhansi, who was fighting in battle. There's Teirangi Topeora, a Maori woman who signed the Treaty of Waitangi in 1940. So people we might think of traditionally as leaders. But I also, like, inspired by Caroline Bressy's book, included Catherine Impey, and who was the publisher of Anti-Caste, this anti-racist newspaper that appeared in late 19th century Britain. And you know, with the removal of the imperialists, she became the only white English person in the book. And I think that that's interesting and might be worth thinking about what are the, you know, consequences of that. But, you know, someone who acted in a more low-key way in some ways, and yet was doing this really important work in terms of bringing together these stories from across the British Empire of racism, including the US, who was so pivotal in, you know, Ida Wells's like tours of England. And so thinking about like all of the different, I think that, you know, the inclusion of women broadened the ways of thinking about what did it look like to experience empire, what, you know, are the different ways that people acted in it. So, and again, two other stories that are kind of a little bit more low key is Anna Mahace. She was an educator in Trinidad, and her parents were both indentured laborers from India. So her story helped us tell the history of indentured labor migration to the Caribbean. It also was a way of talking about missionaries, and also, you know, and she wrote an autobiography. And as to the extent that I could, I chose figures that had left material about their own lives. And so her autobiography is on the University of Florida's Digital Library of the Caribbean Collection. And so I've taught it before to my students or shared it with my students, and that's how I knew about her. But like Margaret Tucker, who also wrote an autobiography, I felt like I had the material to be able to say, you know, what was important to them in their lives. And so I think that those kind of more ordinary stories were also important to include. And also Anna Mahace is one of the most controversial figures in the book because some of the feedback that I've gotten is that it portrays missionaries in too positive of a light. So even though we talk about missionaries elsewhere in the book or are critical of them, for some of the readers in the book, the fact that she actually benefited from her relationship with Canadian Presbyterian missionaries in Trinidad was problematic to them.
Yeah, and if you don't mind, I'd also like to ask, because you've noted that, like, particularly for the work historians typically doing, it's such a unique sort of experience as opposed to the straight publishing experience, straight historical monograph experience. And I'm wondering, like, sort of two related things. One, looking back, like, if there's anything you would do differently about how you approach the project, and then also sort of, if you would do it again, if you think it was a really good experience, if you feel that you would recommend it.
I would absolutely recommend it. I think that our scholarship is really important. And I think that especially if we think about the last 30 years and how scholarship has changed our understanding of the British Empire, who we include in its history, where we think the empire happened, how we explain imperial processes, I think this scholarship is so important and so few people know about it. I think more historians should translate scholarship for the public, whether it's for children or for adult audiences. And I would just absolutely encourage everyone to think about doing that. What would I do differently? I mean, I think that I didn't understand when I started how much time this would take. And that was partly because of the publishers who were really pushing me on a very fast schedule. And that did not account for the work I was putting into reading scholarship, trying to conceive the conceptualization part of the book was really the hardest part. I've talked about the writing challenges, but like thinking about, what to include, what not to include, it takes a lot of time, and commercial children's book authors do not have that time in terms of maintaining an income from commercial publishing, in terms of publishers' timeframes for books. So that's not something that I really understood at the beginning of this project, how much time and work it would ultimately take. I would absolutely do it again. I have an idea for another children's book project, but I'm thinking younger readers and fiction. There are just challenges to writing nonfiction and doing it in an accessible and honest way for young readers. And I'd like to, have a more creative project that's still based on history. I'm thinking of a project that's about South Asian migration to Britain. I was just noticing around the time of Rishi Sunak's election as Prime Minister, how little people in Britain understood about the migration of South Asians to Britain. And I was thinking children's books that kind of centered South Asian children's experiences of migration, which I've come across in my research, would both be sort of, beneficial for public understanding, and also might be an interesting challenge, an interesting new writing challenge for me.
I would look forward to that.
We'll see. I've got a monograph to finish first.
And Christina, is there anything else you'd like to add before we wrap up?
Sure. I mean, one thing that is striking me is since I've read the book, and I'm assuming the rest of the people on the call have not read the book, Radhika keeps talking about how accessible and the difficulty of writing in certain ways for children. But I really want to stress that the book does not in any way shy away from some of the more technical language. So I'm just looking at the glossary here, and these are words that are in the book, and I think one of the things that you do incredibly well is use a word that I did not realize we were using with 8 to 12-year-olds, and then have a sort of short 1 to 2 word explanation in the parentheses. But just so that we're clear on what's in this glossary, we have words like autonomy, capitalism, communism, decolonization, diplomacy, emancipation, First Nations, indigenous, indenture, what was the other one I was looking for? Petition, settler colonialism, and sovereignty. So I think there's also an argument, and this might be a good place to wrap up. I think there's also an argument that Radhika is making, that the book is making, that actually 8 to 12-year-olds and middle grade, that there's actually a much more sophisticated conversation that they can be having about history, provided it is introduced in a not in an appropriate way, but in a way that brings them into these narratives. And I think that this book is making a really compelling argument for us not assuming that this is an age group that cannot handle these conversations. I think you've done a really incredible job in pushing that intervention.
Thank you. And if I can just say one thing about the glossary, the definition of racism, maybe unsurprisingly, took the longest to hammer out. They had a definition that they were using in their other books that was very much about personal prejudice. And I was like, we can't do that. And so that one, I called in a team of colleagues here at Reed to help me work out like how we were going to define racism.
So are you happy with the definition in racism that's in the book now?
Yes,
that is Radhika approved.
Ultimately, I think it points to a more structural set of issues than personal prejudice. So.
All right. Well, thank you so much. I enjoyed hearing so much about it. It's such a beautiful book. I'm glad it exists. So thank you for all the work you put into it. And I hope that everyone here will help me in thanking Christina and Radhika for the conversation today.
Thank you. And I just wanted to say one more thing on Jeffrey's point, if I may, about like historians and kind of recognizing this book as, you know, something serious. And I was just so pleased the PCCBS gave it a special commendation in their book awards. And that was just really meaningful to me to have other historians like recognize the work that went into the book. So thank you all for being here and for your support of the project.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for coming.
Take care.